Hi, and welcome to another edition of Newsmakers Journal of the Vaccine Year. I'm Jerry Roberts. It is Wednesday, July 14th, and today we're going to talk about critical race theory, a phrase and a set of ideas that over the past year has burst into the lexicon of our politics and culture and economy and educational institution. And to help us unpack it, I am delighted to welcome Jean Beaman, who is Associate Professor of Sociology with affiliations in political science, global studies, and the Center for Black Studies Research at UCSB. Professor Beaman received her PhD from Northwestern University and is the author of Citizen Outsider, Children of North African Immigrants in France, published by the University of California Press. Professor, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thank you for having me.
You know, I was amazed, but I have to say not really surprised. I read this week that during the month of June, there were more searches on Google of the phrase critical race theory than there were of Joe Biden. So I don't know if that's
right, one or the other.
Joe Biden,
right.
But give us what is critical race theory? Because there's so many hot takes out there about it. What is it?
Sure. Yeah. And thank you for having me to talk about this important topic. So in brief, critical race theory is a legal framework, which I think is helpful to keep in mind that it comes out of the legal academy. And essentially, it's a way of understanding how race and racism are not sort of, abnormal or aberration, but rather sort of endemic to the structural foundation of our society, right? So critical race theory, among other things, allows us to understand how race and racial categories are social constructions, not biological realities. So it's a legal framework that is taught in law schools and in some sociology programs, but has then what people interpret it to be now is totally different. But that's the actual definition of what it is.
All right, and obviously, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and the anti-racism protests, we've heard it a lot more. And now there are dozens of states, mostly red states, passing and considering laws that are aimed at different things. Some of them, have very vague language and stuff, but the supporters of them all say we have to stop critical race theory from getting into our schools. There's a lot of school board protests. How has it, in your view, happened that critical race theory has become this huge buzzword and I guess a stand-in for a lot of other things?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's really curious to witness as someone who sort of hasn't thought about this or hasn't studied this since years ago in graduate school. But essentially, I think what's happened is, since the death of George Floyd and the subsequent uprisings, not just throughout our country, but really throughout much of Europe and the rest of the world, there's been this sort of backlash to talking about racism as structural, as systemic, excuse me. And so I think that's part of what you're seeing now is with these laws that you've mentioned is a sort of backlash to addressing the fact that racism is still a major problem in our society. So this is a sort of natural quote unquote reaction to actually addressing issues of racism, and also a natural reaction to, frankly, a backlash to the ongoing Black Lives Matter movement, which has gotten more and more attention, especially since the death of George Floyd. So I think what we're seeing now is a sort of conservative response to that movement.
Well, let's talk about some of the both the arguments and the vocabulary that are kind of out there. What is structural racism? What is systemic racism? That's again a phrase that we really hadn't penetrated. I don't think mainstream conversation until after George Floyd. What does that mean?
Yeah, so essentially, and this is often how I explain it to my students at UCSB and my courses on race and ethnicity. So essentially what happened in our sort of US history is that we had this civil rights movement, the various movements of the 1960s. And one of the things that came out of those movements was, various kinds of civil rights legislation, Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, et cetera. And so what this often led to, or sort of how this is interpreted years later is that, structural racism or racism at the level of the government is over, and the only racism that exists is at the level of individuals or individual hearts and minds, if you will. And so a framework as a sociologist and thinking about structural racism or thinking about systemic racism is saying like, okay, hold up. Yes, we had all these gains in the civil rights movement, but that didn't end, persistent, for example, housing discrimination or segregation in our public schools or these sorts of things. So structural systemic racism is a way of thinking about how racism still permeates the institutions in our society, even if it's technically illegal, which it is. Like it's technically illegal to not hire someone because they're Black. Obviously, I'm not saying that's not true. But the point of a systemic racism focus is to think about how even with those laws, we still see the perpetuation of racial inequality. So this is what the framework allows us to understand, particularly in this post-civil rights movement moment that we're in right now, right? So another way of thinking about this that I talk about also, of course, is excuse me, is the framework of colorblind racism, right? And the ways in which, so that, if I could just go into that for a second. So the ways in which, again, after this, one of the things the civil rights movement did and the movements of that era did is, besides changing laws, also change our sort of everyday norms of talking about race, right? So it's no longer, there are obviously exceptions. It's no longer socially acceptable to sort of, openly use a racial epithet in everyday conversation or these kinds of things. Like we understand this living in society, yet nonetheless, people still have these racial biases. Like the racial biases don't go away just because, we have the Voting Rights Act of 1965, for example, right? So how do people still express or still act or still practice these racial biases in a context in which it's no longer socially acceptable to do so? Like we see people as racist, as bad people, and that's a good move. But what I think that means also is that we sort of miss how it still permeates our society, even though these norms and laws have changed. So colorblind racism is another way of thinking about, again, the sociological way of thinking about how people explain racial inequality without using the language of race. So I'll give you an example. So I talk about this a lot in my classes as well. So one thing that people do when they try to explain residential segregation is say, well, it's not a question of race. It's a question of, white people like to live near white people and Black people live near Black people. And that's like a way of sort of, completely ignoring the decades-long history of housing discrimination in our society, right? So that's one way of talking about racial difference without actually talking about race. And this is something that we see presently. And again, a focus on systemic racism allows us to sort of unpack these patterns.
Yeah. So in the book Critical Race Theory by Richard Delgado and Gene Stefanik, which is kind of a primer on it, they say that critical race theory questions the foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law. So am I correct that, what they're really talking about is that race is not a matter of individual bias or what Martin Luther King would say, the content of the character instead of the
right.
It's really a power relationship, which is
absolutely
baked into the law and other things.
Absolutely.
And I think that's where a lot of conservatives' heads begin to explode, because they feel like you're saying that, or that the advocates of critical race theory are saying what we've always understood, that we're all individuals, who can reason with each other, when in fact we're really representatives of racial constructs, and there won't be real change until this struggle between whites and particularly Blacks is resolved. Is that correct?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with everything that you just said. I would just add that, I think, this is part of why we're seeing such a backlash to, what I would put in quotations, critical race theory, because I also wanted to just illustrate that what people are attacking is not actually critical race theory. It's their own sort of perverted version of what it actually is, but nonetheless, is because people are very invested in the United States being founded on particular ideals. And so then when you tell people, when you really get into the sort of history of slavery, and this is sort of, again, thinking about the Nicole Hannah-Jones' 1619 Project and why it's so resonant and why the backlash is so strong, is precisely for that point, because people are so invested in that narrative that if you say, well, actually, these ideals that, form this, what we understand the United States to be, happened simultaneously with the subjugation of African Americans, and then I also would say the simultaneous genocide of Indigenous Americans. That offends, that notion, bringing those things together offends people, which is partly why you're seeing this backlash, both sort of in conservatives, but also not just conservatives, more widespread. But yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing I would say, again, to agree with what you just said, is, when you take it outside of the question of race, we all live in a society. So we understand gender in a society, right? We're individuals, but we live within a society that we're socialized to understand different gender roles different ways. And those are all a result of social processes. And race is no different than that. That's how we understand race. That's how we understand gender. That's how we understand sexuality. We all live in a society, even though we're individuals, we're still living in a society subject to particular social structures that we, either sort of accept or confront or both. Yeah.
Right. And another again, vocabulary thing that is in the middle of this debate, if you can call it national.
Yeah, right.
It's got moving parts. We hear the word equity now, and again, for people of a certain age, from the civil rights movement, it was equality, and particularly equality of opportunity. Now we're talking about equity. Now, is that equity of results? In other words, in any measure, say test scores, if there is a differential between whites and blacks, that is due to racism. Is that the part of this theory?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's well, I don't know if it's so much part of critical race theory, but rather this sort of broader way of understanding systemic racism, which is to say that we have to understand when we take certain ideas, whether they be laws, just ideologies or societies, and hold them up as race neutral, are they really race neutral? So critical race theory, for example, gives us a framework to understand the fact that the law itself, or the construction of the law, has never been race neutral. It is not race neutral. And so of course that obviously offends various people who are invested in, the rule of law, quote unquote, right? And so that same thing is, I would say the same thing about the example of test scores. So these things that we see as sort of, neutral examples or, evidence of merit, quote unquote. Okay, well, what's behind them? If you actually sort of look at the history of standardized test scores, if you look at the history of IQ tests, for example, they very much were designed as a way to promote, white advancement to the detriment of non-whites, right? And so when we use them in a contemporary, in present society, the idea here is that we should be, not so much that we should necessarily disregard them, but regard them or identify them in a particular context that sort of addresses this broader history. Yeah. So it's not so much to say that like the idea itself is racist, but rather that these tests themselves, the way they're constructed, has a racist history. We have to keep that in mind.
So when the equity, equality, when that argument gets applied to test scores, to health outcomes, to home ownership, to any number of things. So is the ideal outcome that all of those things would be equal in terms of race, that there would be no differentials, and that race is the primary factor that comes into forming the differences?
So, I mean, I think this is like a sort of a topic of debate, even among scholars who study race and racism, right? So, I mean, I think I would say, in brief, the idea here is that there's no sort of measure, that there wouldn't be a measurable outcome that's determined just by race, right? So that you couldn't say that, X group got I don't know, whatever opportunity over Y group, and the only thing that distinguishes between them is race, right? Like that's what you kind of want to avoid ostensibly, right? And so one way that like social scientists think about this or have measured this, for example, is the idea of audit studies. So taking like two CVs or resumes that are identical, the only thing that's different is sort of some kind of racial marker of one person being white and the other person being non-white. And so you don't want there to be a statistically significant difference in the number of callbacks, right? Because if the resumes are the same, there shouldn't be any difference, right? But there always, but you know, many studies have showed over the years, there always is a difference. That there always are like more callbacks or more, you know, calls to interviews or being hired for people who are categorized as white versus not. So that's an example of, that's kind of what I mean. Like that's what I mean in terms of sort of equity versus equality versus equity of outcomes. Like you want there to not be a statistically significant difference that you can then subscribe to a racial difference.
And that would go to the notion of implicit bias, I guess, on the part of whoever the decision maker would be, or whoever was making the call. Making those calls.
Yeah, I mean that gets into more sort of, that's less around critical race theory per se, and more around sort of social psychological perspectives on why we still see racial inequality. And one of the sort of ideas of implicit bias is that, you know, we all have these biases that whether or not we know are conscious of it or not, we act on to make sense of society at large and make different decisions in terms of, you know, not just things as major as like who we hire or who we don't, but even, you know, who we sit next to on the train versus who we don't, like these sorts of things. And so that's the idea of implicit bias. So we're constantly, because we all live in the same society, making these different decisions based on what other biases we have related to race, gender, sexuality, religion, what have you. Yeah.
Right. Which would then go to which is another word that we hear all the time that we didn't, well, intersectionality. Can you talk about what that is?
Yeah, sure. So intersectionality, and I should say also critical race theory, you know, was first coined by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a scholar at UCLA and Columbia, and she also coined the framework of intersectionality as we understand it. And so this is another example of a concept that, you know, has a particular genealogy in academia that, you know, when it becomes mainstream, gets kind of perverted and means a lot of different things. But essentially what it means is that our experiences, it comes out of a particular Black feminist framework. And by saying that our experiences of oppression are sort of colored or shaped by other experiences of oppression. So for example, me as a Black American woman, my experiences of racism are also, you know, impacted by the fact that I'm a cisgender woman, or my experiences of sexism are also impacted by the fact that I'm a non-white woman, right? And so these are sort of this idea that, like, you know, when we occupy a particular status, in this case, a racial status, it's not the only identity we have. Of course, we have a gender, we have a religion, or religious affiliation, or we have a sexuality. And so all of these things come together to form how we understand and experience oppression in our society. And so intersectionality provides us a way to think about how all these things come together in, you know, one human body, basically.
So it seems to me, and again, you know, a lot of these bills and legislation that have been written in Texas and Montana and in other states, you know, don't say, you know, critical race theory per se. They have, you know, you can't teach things that are divisive and things. But the thrust of it in terms of public schools, as I understand it, and I'm sure I'm oversimplifying, but is there's that those who are supporting that legislation are saying that these kinds of ideas, anti-racism ideas, are making white kids feel like they are in a, you know, an oppressive group, and they're making Black kids feel like, you know, they are in such an oppressed group that there's nothing that they can do about it. What do you make of that criticism?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's, an unfortunate criticism because I think, again, I'm speaking both as a sociologist and as a Black American, that I think, we often are afraid to, make white people uncomfortable, even at an early age. But, for me personally, I was first called the N-word when I was 8 years old, right? And so there's a way in which, like, learning we're not afraid to make Black kids uncomfortable in public schools. We've been doing that for hundreds of years, right? Like, you know what I mean? So it's like, part of this backlash is really about whose lives or who's sort of who we're trying to comfort in this curricula. And I think that's really what's really upsetting to me. I just recently, and I'm so sorry, I don't remember the state, but like one of the states that has one of these laws was banning talking about the history of Ruby Bridges, who integrated that public school. And so again, like that's I mean, she's a living person, she's still alive, she's only in her 60s. But I mean, again, like not being, it's not even critical race theory, it's like not even literally teaching the history of public school segregation, which existed up until very recently, historically speaking, in our society. I mean, that's not critical race theory, that's just like history. And I think that's really scary that kids are not able to, in the K through 12 system, learn about these things that actually literally happened to actual people that are still alive, because it's seen to make certain people uncomfortable. I think that's very disturbing. Whereas for me, as a black woman, as someone who learned about the history of Ruby Bridges at a younger age, it was inspiring for me to learn of a Black girl who integrated her school like at such a young age. I mean, obviously when I was younger, I didn't understand the whole history around it, but I mean, nonetheless, like I think that does a different kind of work. And it's really unfortunate that, not just Black kids, but just all kids can't even learn about that history with these kinds of laws. I mean, it's really, I think it's really dangerous. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it is, and you kind of get this strange situation where both sides are calling the other side totalitarian. In other words,
right? Yes. Yeah. Of course. Yeah.
You can't. We will not have this kind of subject matter which is obviously against sort of all Enlightenment values.
Right.
The other side saying, well, you're trying to police our language on the First Amendment, and I'm not sure how that political struggle gets resolved. But let me ask you about two other things, because again, in the popular culture and widespread, the two people that we've heard about and a lot and their ideas. One is this woman, Robin DiAngelo, who's written a book, White Fragility, and I think she has a new book out called Nice Racism or something like that.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And yeah, the essential point that she makes is racism is ordinary, not aberrational, as you said,
right.
said earlier. And a key quote from her, she says, the question in any situation is not did racism take place, but how did racism manifest? And I just, I think when people look at that, sometimes you say, well, how do we ever get out of this then? Where does that end? What's the end point? How do we measure success from a situation like that?
Right. Well, that's a $1 million question, right? I mean, that's if I knew the best answer, I probably wouldn't need a day job. But
well,
no, I mean, I mean, but in all seriousness, I mean, I think it's having discussions like this. I think it's talking about it. And that's why I think, I think it's not being afraid to have these sort of quote unquote uncomfortable conversations. So personally, I feel really fortunate that I'm able to teach courses on race and racism at UCSB and really unpack this with students, because, we just don't have a lot of opportunities in our society, in our lives, to actually talk about these things seriously, with actual data, with actual research. I think that's the thing that's missing. So that's how that's why we sort of get away from it. Funny enough, but I mean, the one way we don't get away from it is not talking about it. I mean, I think that's a problem. That's one of the dangers of these laws. Like, not talking about it is actually gets us further away from what people pretend to want to go, right? I mean, like, actually ignoring a problem doesn't solve a problem. I mean, there's a million examples of that we can name, right? And so that's, and also just as a college educator, as a college professor, I spent a lot of time in my courses, sort of, having students unlearn kind of what they learned in the K through 12 system, to be honest, because they don't learn about racism as something that's true in present society. They learned about something that happened like 5 billion years ago, right? And so like I have to really unpack with them, what exactly the civil rights movement was, what the different laws that were passed, what the legacy of that is, what does the current data say about, for example, public school segregation or the black-white wealth gap. Like these are things that I wish, students, we were able to talk about in the K-12 system, so that for like in college, we don't have to spend so much time, really teaching students things that they could have learned a lot earlier. So that's part of the issue really, is that like we just like are continually afraid to talk about these things with any real evidence behind them. And it's really unfortunate.
Yeah, and then the other kind of widely read book is How to Be an Anti-Racist. I think is the title by Ibram X. Kendi.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
he talks about how there again there is no such thing as race neutrality. That any policy, any government policy is either racist or it's anti-racist. It can't be, it's one or the other. It's a zero-sum game. It says the only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. And again, I think you see a lot of conservative heads exploding when they hear that kind of thing, because they said, we were all past this. Where people were judged by their color. What do you make of that?
Yeah, no, I think this is, partly what happens when people do, I think, frankly, a deliberate misreading of, the words of Martin Luther King, among others, right? Who, they completely distort the I have a dream speech, to say that he's saying like people shouldn't be judged on the color of their skin, but he actually has many writings and has said multiple times about the sort of persistence of systemic racism and how, it's not just so much in the minds of individual white people, but it actually is a broader issue of white society or white dominated society. The other thing is that I think that is really important to keep in mind, and particularly in thinking about critical race theory and why it's talked about so much now, is that we continue to have this sort of narrative in the United States of always forward racial progress. So, I'm sure you remember when Barack Obama was first elected, it was sort of like, yay, USA is, post-racial, whatever that means, right? And it's like, it's always this idea of like, we had, hundreds of years of slavery, and now we have a first Black president. So it's all wiped, the slate is wiped clean, right? And then, when you had the election of Donald Trump, people had to sort of think about a way to explain that. And then it's like, okay, well, then there's like some individual racist, but it doesn't actually mean that the US is racist. And so I think part of what you're seeing right now is people trying to make sense of both those things. Like, how can we have 2 terms of Barack Obama as president and then have whatever Trump was, and in the same society that's ostensibly always better than it was before? Like, we're always better than we were 50 years ago. Ostensibly 50 years from now will be better than where we are right now. Like, we're always moving in a forward direction versus what has actually historically been true, which is there's always a sort of, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or whatever the expression is, right? There's a sort of, end of slavery and Reconstruction, but then Jim Crow. There's the civil rights movement, then the immediate, war on drugs, Nixon backlash kind of thing, right? And so that actually is more the history of this country, but we have to imagine that it's always moving forward. And so I think that's partly why you're seeing, that partly also explains why you're seeing the sort of backlash around critical race theory, or how people understand critical race theory right now.
Yeah, no, I think that's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I think that's correct. And I just have a minute left, but I have to ask you, because we talked a little bit before, a lot of your research is in France, but this whole notion of critical race theory and the expanding definition of it for political purposes, you also have seen in your research in France, correct?
Yes. So there's been, especially just in the last like 6 months or so, Macron, the president, and his administration has been accusing activists in France, accusing Black folks in France of importing American frameworks. So it's like when people talk about racism in France, it's like, oh, you're only saying that because you're just reacting to what's happening in the United States versus, France having its own problems of racism. So there's an interesting way that like critical race theory is being like attached to the United States. So anytime any other society mentions it, it's like they're sort of, being overly influenced by the Americans, like the evil Americans.
Which
So,
is another way of not talking about it, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. This isn't it to another place of saying the United States is the racist country, not France. But but it's much more complicated than that.
All right. Well, Professor Jean Beaman, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. And
Thank you.
This is a massive issue, and I hope to have you. You'll come back sometime, and we can continue the conversation.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.